So there's a myth floating out there that education is neutral. That somehow that when you teach children their ABCs in English and mathematics and all the different subjects, that you're not bringing any of your own personal worldview or ideas. There's no character formation involved. It's just simply a transfer of information, right?
And that is a myth.
It's a myth, right?
Yes.
It couldn't be further from the
Yes.
truth. Richard Weaver wrote a book called Ideas Have Consequences. And in the book, he says that one of the most devastating things that's happened today as a result of modern and postmodern philosophy on the education system is the divorce of religion and spiritual formation from the transfer of information in education.
Or the attempt to do so.
The attempt to do so, because you can't do it, right?
Exactly.
You can't separate spiritual formation, religious education from
But they're trying to say that is happening today.
They're trying to say that's happening, and a lot of parents believe it.
Right.
They'll say that, okay, well, I can send my child to this public school, and they're not being taught any rival worldview to mine. They're just simply learning the facts that'll help them be successful, but that's not the case at all.
Correct.
What do you tell me a little bit about what you think about that?
Sure. Well, I've had the opportunity to talk to quite a few parents on this topic in the last several years, and there's a couple things that I'm seeing from parents. And the first thing that I'm seeing is that parents don't even understand that their children are getting a worldview. Again, just what you just said, they believe that it's neutral. If my children go to this school, they're going to get the academics, and then when they come home at night, I can teach them about Jesus, and I can teach them about the gospel, and I can take them to church on Sunday, do devotions, and so that's how they're going to get their religious or value system upbringing,
Right.
Which is very opposite from the truth. A lot of people say that the school system is neutral. It is not neutral.
Yeah.
When you take God out of the equation,
Yeah.
that's actually saying something.
Yeah, that is a worldview.
That is a worldview.
In and of itself. Like, if you're not including God into subject like science, the way you teach biology, the way you teach all those different disciplines, if you don't believe God created everything, or you can't say God created everything, it's going to change the way you present the information.
Correct. So that's what the one thing that I'm seeing is they're not even realizing that their children are getting a contrary worldview to what they're experiencing at home.
Right.
The other thing that I'm seeing is a lot of people don't even know what a worldview is, and they haven't really thought through that concept.
Sure.
And we know that a worldview truly is the way you see the world, the lens in which you see the world. So like you were just talking before, there's the worldview that God does not exist. That is a worldview. The way we as Christians see the world is through the lens of Scripture. So we believe that if God says something in the Bible, then that is true. And so we take those concepts that God teaches and we put that against what we're seeing in the world, how we want to live in the world, how we're interpreting what's happening in the world through that biblical worldview.
Sure.
So again, we're seeing a lot of people who think that there's a neutral worldview going on in the public school system, is so far from the truth, and they're not even understanding that there is a worldview.
Right.
And so I think that it's really important for parents to understand that, because they may make decisions differently, or whatever decision that they make for their family is between them and their family, but it's important that they know what they're up against, that their children are going to be receiving a worldview no matter where they go to school.
Right, absolutely. And I've noticed 4 different worldviews. I mean, there's probably a lot more than that, but there's 4 main worldviews that have stuck out to me that I definitely see in the public school system,
Okay.
And also see propping up sometimes in different private Christian schools. And so the 4 worldviews are individualism, relativism, reductionism, and then revisionism. And so
Those are some big words.
big words, and I'll unpack them briefly. Right? You could probably have a whole conversation about each one of those,
Sure.
and so I'll just talk about each one in a brief way. So the first one is individualism, and that's the idea that God is not at the center of my life, but that I'm at the center of my life, and His expectations for me, what my family thinks of me, what my community thinks of me, ultimately doesn't matter. What's important is that I'm happy, and that my personal happiness is the way in which I define my life. And so what it does is it creates very egocentric children and very egocentric adults and an egocentric society, and the result of that is destructive.
I see that so much. I see people all the time saying, this doesn't make me happy, so I'm not going to do this anymore, or I'm going to move on and do this because this is what makes me happy. It's all about me.
Or I don't feel a certain way.
So much about feelings. So much about feelings.
Yeah, and not enough about truth.
That's true.
The second worldview kind of comes out of this one. They kind of complement one another. Is relativism, and this is the idea that what's true for you is not necessarily true for me.
Yes.
Right? We've heard this a lot.
Yes.
You've heard it before.
Speak your truth.
Speak your truth.
Or your truth is your truth.
Yeah.
Yes.
But don't oppose your opinions or ideas on me, right?
Right.
It's this idea that there is no absolute truth.
Right.
That there's only little t truths, and every culture, every person has their little t truth. But keep that to yourself. Don't necessarily bring that into the public square and discuss it or talk about it.
Right.
And so we know that, again, this can be very destructive because it's teaching children that there's no moral absolutes, that there's no...
Anything goes.
Anything goes.
Right.
If they decide it to be true and they don't like what someone else is telling them is true, even though it actually might be true, they don't have to listen to it.
What a confusing world to grow up in.
Yeah.
When you see black and somebody else says that's white, the sky is purple. Like, who are you to say what's true? That has to be very confusing for children.
No, it absolutely is.
Because common sense tells you that there are truths.
Right, absolutely. And we know from a Christian worldview that telling the truth and knowing that there's an absolute truth is a big part of properly loving somebody, right? You can't really love someone the way that God has commanded us to and asked us to if you're not honest with them. And that's not just a Christian idea. I think that's common sense to everyone. Everyone would say, I can't really love someone unless I'm honest with them, right? Lying to them, not telling them the full truth, that's not really loving somebody. Right. And so part of being able to agree that there is absolute moral truth and being able to share your opinions and ideas in an authoritative way and being able to appeal to God's standard, that's all important for our process of loving someone, of not being harsh in the way we do it, being gracious, but sharing the truth with them in love, right?
So that's very much rejected in today's society.
It is, and I think no one actually believes in total relativism. I don't think anyone really. Everyone, in some sense, knows that there's some moral truth, absolute truth that we should all obey, and so I think it's really just a way of keeping God's standard out of the education system and the way we do things and the way we teach our kids. The other worldview, the third one, is reductionism, and this is based on the idea of scientific reductionism, which comes from Darwinism, and it's the idea that human beings can basically just be reduced back to a clump of cells, that we're just highly evolved animals, that we're not people with souls. There's a spiritual part to us, that we're created in the image of God, right? And so that idea would reject the idea that God has made us in His image. And so you can imagine what this does to the way kids think.
It has to be confusing
how they
for them.
view themselves. It is. Yeah. Well, it's like how the old adage goes. I don't know who said it, but I've heard this many times before. If you treat kids like animals, right, then eventually they'll start acting like animals and acting instinctually and not seeing themselves with the type of self-worth and value and dignity that God wants them to have as image bearers.
Right.
And so I know, you being in the education system.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've actually seen that in behavior management. It's called behavior modification.
Right.
And that's something that most teachers have been taught, that you have your little chart on the wall, and if a child does something positive, they move up on the chart. They may get a candy at the end of the day. If they do something negative or a bad negative choice, then they get some sort of consequence. And there's, God does call us to do great things to honor Him, but it's not because we're going to get a candy at the end of the day.
Right.
It's to honor Him. And so I see that a lot in the school system, where teachers are using that as a way to modify behavior versus understanding that they have people in front of them who are made in the image of God, and there's a different way to inspire them to do what's right in the eyes of the Lord.
Absolutely. And what's crazy about that is there's good Christian teachers in the public school system, obviously in Christian schools,
Sure.
But they were taught in college or wherever that might have been, or at a previous school, to discipline that way. And they don't even realize the worldview behind it, and what they're doing is really not Christ-centered, but it's actually probably the opposite of the way you want to be approaching children.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, I've definitely seen that one.
And so the last worldview is revisionism, right? And so this comes from another worldview called Marxism. I won't get into what Marxism is or cultural Marxism. That's a whole other conversation again in and of itself. But revisionism is basically the idea that Western culture, with Christ being at the center of the motivation and the success behind why Western Christendom is the way it is, why we have our government the way it is, why we have our schools the way we do, why we have our art and music and just everything that is good about Western Christian culture, that we need to reject that. And that
I am seeing that.
Yes.
It's different than when we were growing up. Those people were honored.
Yeah.
Even though they were flawed.
Sure.
But today they're all the enemy for some reason.
Yeah. So right, the heroes of our past become today's villains.
Incredible.
And that's what kids are being taught. And I don't think I'm being radical in saying that. It's definitely happening. It's a different way than how the Christian worldview would approach it. And so Christians, we want to see the people that did great things in the past, right? And we want to, acknowledge their flaws and recognize those, but also recognize them for the good things that they did as well.
God used them.
And how God used them. And let the gospel shape the way we look at them. But that's not the idea behind revisionism. It's this very one-sided, they're evil, they're oppressive, they're patriarchal, we can't trust them, we can't trust the narrative that they've put forth, and so we just kind of need to see them as villains and enemies altogether, and kind of rewriting history and to repaint them, repaint them in a negative light. That's where the idea of revisionism comes from. They're revising the way we see our heroes of the past and culture as how it's been in the past.
So that changes history, it changes the art that the children experience, the literature that they're experiencing.
Yep, it all gets thrown out. So kids aren't interacting with great music or great artists or the great books anymore. All of that is kind of put to the side, and they're learned this newer material, which was written in the past 50 to 60 years, with a rival worldview to Christianity. And it's not the environment that I want my children to be learning in. It's not that I don't want them competing with rival worldviews or learning about rival worldviews.
We want them to learn all the views.
Yeah, yes. I want them to interact with those things, but not in that type of environment. I want it to be an environment where Christ is seen as the central point of all learning, and being able to interact with those ideas in that way. And so those are the four worldviews. Those are the ones I see probably affecting kids the most, and the effects are very destructive.